Well, welcome. It is, at least by our measures here, exactly 4 o'clock. Thank you so much for giving up part of your day to be on this call. Just a reminder, if you are interested in chatting and contributing to the chat section, at the top of your page or at the bottom, there should be a bar that drops down with the things, with a 3 dots saying more. Click on that and chat, and that should bring you to the chat section. Another thing to make sure of when you are chatting and contributing to that chat section is to make sure you're putting it to all panelists and attendees, because sometimes folks put it to just the panelists and then not everyone gets to see it. So that's really important to do that. So just welcome. My name's Laura Wesley. I'm with the Constitutional Rights Foundation, and with me is
Sarah Badawi, also with CRF.
And at home sick is our other fearless leader, Carrie Doggett. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here today because she's not feeling well, but she is answering some chat questions, so she should be, and we know that she is online there. So again, thank you so much. And as Sarah mentioned, we're super excited to see all the North Carolina folks. We heard that there were some big power outages in North Carolina, so we're super thrilled to have the North Carolina folks on the call with us today. All right, so let's get started. So we want to honor your time. So our goal is to have this done in 30 minutes. So we hope that's 4:30 California time, 7:30 East Coast time. So that's one of our goals today. But this webinar, we're just going to give you a quick overview of the T2T project. You're going to be able to meet your teacher leaders virtually. So we do have a lot of new folks. We have over 200 new online folks that are participating as new cohort teachers for the different cohorts. So they'll be able to meet their teacher leaders, at least virtually. We'll show you some of their great photos. And then we're also going to get some of your feedback on how that first learning cycle went. So those civil conversations, just hearing from you what your thoughts were on that. And then we'll just introduce you to some basic ingredients to role plays and simulations as academic discussions. You'll be getting more in-depth information about that strategy when you meet your teacher leaders face-to-face, or if you're the online cohort when we do the live webinar on that role plays and simulations. You'll actually get a chance to get your hands dirty with that. And then we'll go over some next steps. So just quickly for those new folks, a little background on this project. This project is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and really they're looking at the role that teacher leaders can play in providing professional development to teachers, and also looking at shifts in teacher practice to see whether or not can make these shifts to these new state standards. So that was kind of the goal. And they funded the Center for the Future of Teaching and Learning at West Ed, who in turn funded 6 organizations. You can see the 6 organizations down there. CRF is one of them. We're kind of the one social studies group, but we are, this project that we're working on is involving both social studies and ELA teachers in middle school and high school. But some of the, you can see that we are in good company there with the National Writing Project, the National Board, Teach Plus, Teaching Matters, and ReadWorks. And again, for those of you who don't know who we are, Constitutional Rights Foundation, we're located in Los Angeles, California, and we have some awesome partners, and I know I just saw them log in, so I know they're here tonight. We have Val McVeigh from the Florida Joint Center, and then we also have from Carolina K-12, Christy Norris. So we could not do this project without them. They are our lifesavers, and we're so appreciative to have these great folks involved in this project with us. Here are your wonderful teacher leaders. So you can see in the left-hand side, we have our Florida folks. We have some new ones this year. We have Christine there towards your left. Jennifer and Frank have also joined this project this year. On the bottom there are our fearless Los Angeles teacher leaders. And then in the right-hand side, you'll see our folks returning from North Carolina. And then we have our online teacher leaders. So some of our teacher leaders are doing double duty. Not only do they have their face-to-face cohorts, they also graciously agreed to lead our online cohort. So we're very thankful to them. We have Ben and Regina there, and then also Avo at the bottom. So thank you so much for taking the lead on those online cohort. And teacher leaders, if you're here, if you want to just type in teacher leader from where you're from, that would be awesome, so that everyone could see you.
So before we jump into talking about role plays and simulations, which is really the focus of, which is the academic discussion strategy that we're going to be focusing on this semester, we'd love to hear just briefly from folks who have already been involved in Learning Cycle 1, which focused on a strategy, for those of you who are new, focused on a strategy we call the civil conversation. We're eager to hear from people who have used it, and if you could just, in a couple of quick points in the chat box, share with us responses to any of those prompts that are up there on the slide. Some successes, some high points, something that surprised you, student outcomes that you noticed, shifts in your own practice that you observed, things that you did differently than maybe you would have done before having participated in the Teach-to collab, and then if there's anything that would help you to use this strategy even better in the future. For those of you who are new either to the online cohort or the new to some of our face-to-face cohorts, don't worry, we're going to make sure that we work with you and your teacher leaders to get you caught up on this civil conversation strategy, but we hope that hearing a little bit from folks who have used it will help you get excited that we've got something good in store for you and your students. So if you could just take a couple seconds, I see some comments already coming in to share some feedback with us. So one person mentions that they could see a link to that student engagement was very high, and that they could definitely see the connections between the conversation students were having and the sort of speaking and listening standards that we're hoping to address through this strategy. So that's great to hear.
I see some saying they create a little more interest in the topics that they were learning about by having that civil conversation.
Someone mentioned that it's helpful to have the CRF discussion guide, which includes annotation strategies. That's something we've heard from teachers before, and we're glad to hear that providing a pretty simple structure can help facilitate these kinds of conversations.
Yeah, and I love what Kelsey says about using the civil conversation structure was a meaningful way to incorporate text into the discussion, kind of an alternative to Socratic seminar. Thanks, Kelsey.
A lot of information coming in, and this is what we've heard before, so it's great to see it here too, that so many more students get involved, and that students really do drive the conversation based on a text, based on evidence, and really get engaged. Oh, these are just the messages. Okay, great.
Great, wow, these are wonderful responses. We are recording this, just so everyone knows, we are recording this. We will download the chat section as well. So especially for those who are new to the civil conversation strategy, you'll be able to read through some of these comments that might be helpful. Great. All right, so Learning Cycle 2, yay! Using role-play simulations as academic discussion. Why? Well, one thing that we talk about, it's a little, this using role plays and simulations are going to be a little different than the civil conversation model, right? Because remember in the civil conversation, we basically gave students a bunch of information. They were able to pick things that they agreed with, things that they disagreed with, and come to some sort of, conclusion or opinion. Well, in using role plays and simulations, we're going to be speaking more about a forced perspective, right? Getting students out of their own particular opinions, or in some cases, out of their parents' opinions that they're just reiterating. So giving them that opportunity to, again, think of something from maybe even a different perspective than their own, or it might be their perspective, but giving them that forced perspective. And what that might look like is, for example, maybe a moot court activity, right, where you have the government arguing something, for example, that there was not a violation of a Fourth Amendment constitutional issue, and then you have the defendant saying, yes, it was a violation. So having them, or maybe they're going to be playing the role of a justice. So giving them that understanding an issue through a forced perspective is important. And then also allowing multiple perspectives as well. So we want to make sure in our role plays and simulations that it's not just one perspective, that we're getting multiple, at least two, if not more, perspectives on the issue. And another rationale for using role plays and simulations is that it's actually motivating. Kids are excited to learn about something through a different strategy rather than maybe just listening to a lecture and then answering some questions about it. And Sarah and I were actually talking about it before, and we're saying, gosh, that's how I really remember things. Like, I remember things in school that I did, simulations of government activities or what have you, not just what the teacher lectured to me about.
Or what I read about in
right,
the book. Yeah.
Right. So it is motivating for students to be able to do things, doing role plays. It really changes things up a bit. And again, we're making sure that the text that we're using is challenging, right? That there's evidence to make their arguments. They're making those evidence-based arguments. They're understanding their particular point of view that they're being assigned, and they're also being able to recognize maybe biases in that point of view. And this all culminates in a really rich discussion among students.
So over the years, CRF, working with a lot of teachers around the country, have identified ingredients for what we need to have a role play or simulation translate into a meaningful academic discussion. And there are a few things that we're going to go through quickly here. So one is that there needs to be an issue or a question to be decided, on which there are at least two viewpoints, so that kids are being asked to come to some kind of conclusion from their forced perspective. And again, this forced perspective is something that's very important in a role play or simulation. And it's something that it can be challenging for students academically in the sense that they have to, make an argument that they may not agree with. But it's also something that I've observed in my own teaching that can also be a useful developmental challenge for kids, given where they are. They're not always great at taking other people's perspectives. And so for adolescents to have to take on another point of view can be a really useful exercise. To help this discussion work, kids do need an overview of the topic. They need, like I said before, something to decide, and where their role in making a decision is clear. These are still text or evidence-based activities in their respective roles. From their forced perspective, students still have to refer to texts and to evidence to make their arguments. We found that policy issues and court cases often work very well for this, that they allow students to accomplish these things, and that they're, a role play or simulation can be especially useful in a class where you're trying to help students understand about the functioning of some kind of democratic process. So whether it's a legal process or a congressional hearing or some other democratic process, rather than just explaining it in civics class, defining what it is, but giving kids a chance to experience what a city council meeting might look like, for example. So certainly for folks who are teaching in US history classes, that can be great, but even for teachers teaching world history or ELA, that this gives students good practice with democratic processes. One thing I just want to add quickly is that in terms of the policy issues that we mentioned and court cases that can also often work well, is that the question or policy issue can be from the past. It doesn't have to be, sorry, I'm back on the previous slide. I'm just going back to, sorry. So the policy issues in court cases, just to highlight, because I think people often think in terms of US history for this kind of activity, but that the question or policy issue can come from the past. So for example, students might do some kind of simulation of a debate among policy advisors in Han, China on the government's monopolies on salt and iron. So it's a clear policy issue that they're deciding, but in a historical context. In order to help these work well, these kinds of role plays and simulations as academic discussions, it's important to really keep your eye on the prize. Keeping in mind that the goal that you're looking for is substantive academic discussion. Like Laura mentioned before, it's not a play with a script, and like Laura mentioned before, the emphasis isn't really on acting or costumes, but we're really trying to get kids to engage with the ideas and the different perspectives that are represented around some particular issue. Obviously, and many of you, we've talked with many of you about this over the months with folks who have been involved, but it's really important, especially when you're getting into any kind of emotionally charged issues or something that could be controversial, to know your students and your community. You know, it's important to just be mindful of who's in your class and their background when you are engaging in these kinds of activities. So important to avoid having students role play religious rituals or asking them to act like another race or ethnic group. I think another important element here in terms of knowing your students and the community is also in terms of knowing the material that you're talking about, and that the question before the kids needs to be an open issue, meaning that there is still something to discuss about it. We were talking here about some of the issues that we see as sort of closed issues around which there may be room for discussion, but where it would be important to be careful around debating whether something was right or wrong. Closed issues like the questions of slavery or racism or the Holocaust, for example, and just being very mindful of the roles that you're asking kids to take on for the forced perspectives. And then also just to sort of preserve, so that students can feel comfortable. You know, you don't have to have students share their own opinions at the end. And again, you know, this is something that would be up to you depending on the relationship that you have with your students. But don't feel like you need to do that if it would be difficult for them.
Great. So, so there are different types of role plays and simulations, and they're not all created equal. So luckily we have a curriculum library that we are going to share with you, so that you don't have to go find your own role plays and simulations. But the first thing we're going to talk about is moot court versus mock trial. I often have teachers ask me, like, well, what's the difference between the two? When we're talking about role plays and simulations as academic discussions, probably leaning mostly to a moot court versus a mock trial. And a moot court is more of is an appellate court process, whether it be state, federal, or Supreme Court, where mock trial is basically a trial for the first time, where you're having witnesses, you might have a judge and jury. That's a mock trial, and often that lends itself more to things like a script and costuming and things like that. I'm not going to say a mock trial can never be an academic session, but when you're looking at them, it's probably safer to stick with moot court, where you're deciding some really important having students decide some important constitutional issue. Another example of a role play simulation is congressional committees, legislative hearings, any sort of public meeting. It could be a school board meeting where students are playing school board members, and there's community members, deciding some important issue that's going to impact the school.
And in those kinds of meetings where there are different constituencies, Laura and I were talking about this before, that can be a great opportunity to bring in different perspectives into a conversation, because if you have kids role-playing different constituencies, then you have that ingredient right there.
Right. And then some other examples is that it doesn't have to just be, a public meeting or some sort of current event. You can look at different types of government or legal bodies, and this doesn't have to just be current. It can take place sometime historically or even in other countries. So you can go beyond our current legal system or legislative process. And we're going to go ahead and just show you our curriculum library. So let's see, it's senior share, and let's see, it's not it though.
It's just on the wrong tab.
Great. So this is our curriculum library. We'll make sure you all have the link. But if you scroll down to the bottom, and hopefully you can all see, you should be looking at the T2T website. It should say role play and simulations at the top. And if you look here, we have role plays and simulations for different topics. So we have world history, we have current events, police use of force, police commissions, what should the U.S. do about North Korea's nuclear weapons, and that's where students will take the role of senators and legislative analysis, analyzing different policies and trying to recommend or persuade why their policy is the best. We have U.S. history. This has a lot of, we have the Federalist Papers, we have voting and equality, and then we have government and econ. And this one has a lot of moot court activities as well, so PowerPoints and moot court activities on constitutional issues. So that's our library. Hopefully you'll be able to find something that you are teaching to go ahead and try that out with your class, with one class. Just so you know, we're just kind of going over the basics of ingredients for these role plays and simulations, but you're really going to go more in depth about this approach in your face-to-face. And then the online participants will be working with Ben and Regina on March 15th to delve deeper into using the strategy. Let's go back to our PowerPoint. All right. So next steps. Okay, so this is for all, we're getting close to the end here, and then we'll take some questions if you have them. So next steps for all cohorts. You're gonna attend your next face-to-face with your teacher or leader. You're gonna hopefully look at the curriculum library there, pick a role play simulation to use with one class of students. Then you're gonna reflect on the discussion board, similar to the civil conversation reflection that you had online last semester, and then you'll attend a debrief webinar. And then obviously if you have any questions about this process, you can definitely speak to any of your teacher leaders or to us. And then if you're joining, you'd work part of the cohort last semester, you're joining us this semester, make sure that, and you want a little bit more support about using civil conversations before you try it out, we will be having a live webinar, Q&A webinar with Ben and Regina on January 30th at 7. So we'll make sure all the new folks get that information so that if you want to have some help before you try out that civil conversation in your classroom, we can make sure we provide that to you.
For those of you who are in the online cohort, you've heard from me in a few emails over the last few weeks, but just to quickly recap, and we'll be sending more reminders. Basically, where we are now in the online cohort is we're hoping that you will watch one of the civil conversation webinars that are available on the curriculum library page between now and January 30th, when you will have the opportunity, like Laura mentioned, to take part in a live webinar Q&A session with Ben and Regina about any specific questions you might have about trying this, before you try this strategy in your own classrooms. And then give it a try with your students and reflect on that on the discussion boards. And I'll be sending information to you shortly about where we're going to host that online discussion. And so you all, the folks in the online cohort, will be sort of focused on the civil conversation for the next month or so, or a couple of months, and then shift gears a little bit to the nuts and bolts of the role play simulation, which we've introduced today in a live webinar on March 15th to, like Laura was saying, sort of get your hands dirty and start really thinking about how to implement that in your classroom.
So some final reminders. We are going to be having a National End of Project webinar to kind of debrief how this project went. That's going to take place May 31st, 4 o'clock Pacific, 7 o'clock Eastern. We understand some of our North Carolina, Florida folks might already be in some deserted island by then, as school will be over, but we do hope that you'll participate, because it's really valuable to hear from everyone and bring the community back together again, to hear how these strategies work in the classroom. You'll also, part of your stipend requirement will be to take a short GATES evaluation. We're not quite sure when that's going to be released. They usually give us a couple week window to have our folks participate in that. Last year it was really short. It only took maybe 5 minutes or less. So you'll be on the lookout for that evaluation. And then finally, stipends. We'll be making sure folks get their stipends in early June, if not sooner. We'll also be sending out certificates of participation to everyone who completed the project, as well as a letter to your principal. And again, you can opt out of that letter to your principal. We'll make sure we give you the opportunity before we send that. But those are kind of the 3 things you'll be getting: your stipend, your certificate, and the letter to your principal. Great. So if you still have questions, we're going to be here online, being able to answer questions here live. You can also contact us individually. I put Sarah's information up there as well as my own. Obviously, your teacher leaders are great resources. You can contact them, as well as Val and Christy. So yes, Hector. Yes, we are people who are new. This semester, the project will also be receiving a stipend. So we have,
who are new to the face-to-face cohort. Yes, and many people who are joining the online cohort will also be receiving a stipend. Thank you all so much.
Yeah.
And like Laura said, please don't hesitate to be in touch with us or your teacher leaders if you need anything else.
And again, we'll stay on and see if we see any hands raised, any questions. Oh, there's a hand. I wonder if I can unmute her. Let's see. Hi, Chandra. I'm going to see if I can probably promote her to panelist. Chandra, if you can put your question in the chat section, that would be great. That way we don't have to figure out your microphone and such. I did.
Oh,
great.
Sorry.
Okay.
Did somebody answer it?
No, that's why her hand is raised.
Oh, okay.
Okay, we can. I don't know if we can try to find it.
All right. We'll try to find your question, Shawanda. She's the yellow teacher. Wait, hang on, move the cursor and I'll. Sorry. It's okay, just put it in, can you just